You're listening to a Very Spatial podcast, episode 722, September 17th, 2023.
Hello and welcome to a Very Spatial podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb.
And this is Frank.
And this week we'll be talking to the folks over at GapMaps about their entree into North America. But of course, before that, we have some news. First news this week is the announcement, the collaboration announcement for fiscal year 2024, which of course starts in 2023 and continues on through 2024.
For the federal fiscal year 2024.
U.S. federal fiscal year.
Yeah, U.S. federal.
For the 3D national topography model. And this incorporates the coalescence, I'm going to use that word, sure, of the 3D EP.
3DEP, as everyone calls it.
And the 3D HP, which I don't think we've called it anything other than 3D HP.
No, I don't think so.
It's relatively recent, too.
Yeah, it is. And actually, I don't really remember them announcing. Okay, so this announcement came across like all the state coordinators, GIS coordinators' desks, and all the agencies and stuff like that. So we saw a lot of it this week coming across this the terrain model. It's based on the hydrography model, too. And I don't remember that being announced. That's the weird thing. I remember it was replaced, but I don't remember like that being really announced and all the agencies being pulled into it. It's a little odd.
But yeah, so now this national topography model, NTM, is the one that kind of conflates the two.
Yes, and I think this is like all the other ones, and that the notion is that the U.S. federal government's going to set a standard, and all the states can get a buy-in to, basically up the resolution a little bit if they want, or to send their data in there and get sort of integrated. It's a pretty cool program. It's what they did with 3DEP program. The problem I have with it is that I don't think it was uniform across the states. By that, I mean that all states got access to the federal program, but it was left to each of the states to determine how that would work. And as a result, you end up with uneven quality, I think, as far as at the local level. So at the national level, yes, it's all at a certain quality because that's what the standard says. But the buy-up and who got a little bit better and all that sort of stuff, sometimes it was statewide, sometimes it was counties, and there's a lot of unevenness, which is for the localities, and I said, what you see is from where you sit, and I said very much at the state level, it wasn't as smooth as I would like for the 3DEP, and so I hopefully do a little bit better for this, but since it's based upon the 3DEP and the 3D HP, I bet it won't.
Well, and it's the same thing with is it NAPE?
Yeah.
I don't know, there's so many different NAPE, and
NAPE. In National Aerial Imagery Program, NAPE.
But it's the same thing that states can, and it's usually state at that point, can, toss in a little extra money to get an extra band, get extra resolution, spatial resolution. So it's not too surprising, but you do have the standard, like you're saying, that you have the least common denominator. So you can always, if you have higher resolution and you need to work over a larger area, you can always de-res down to the standard.
Yeah, I mean, my complaint is that, as in often in these situations, the have-nots suffer a little bit.
Yeah. So,
the states that really could use an extra bit of oomph don't necessarily get that access. But, I get the federal agencies are doing what they need to do for the federal agencies, including the states at any level, is just kind of a nicety, which is good, but this is just me knocking the programs.
Well, it's a little bit more than a nicety, because this is one of the things that you were graded on as a state as part of the NSGIG report card. So this is something that states should be aware of, that, this does impact that geospatial report card you get that says how your state's doing and where it's going. So it is a good thing to look into being a part of, to talk about with everyone in your state in order to go, how is this going to influence our standing within the federal agencies and the federal government?
Well, next up, we've actually got some more potential data news. So this is I think, a little exciting, but in a recent webinar that NSGIC did, so the National States Geographic Information Council, if you're not familiar. We've kind of been talking about them periodically. But essentially, a U.S. Census Bureau geographer in a webinar, which was actually on gridded census data, had some discussion about how that potentially is coming, and they're working on ways on how they would publish it. So they're planning to publish gridded data sets. So as I noted, that's data sets essentially that are geographic units with a regular pattern, without overlap, without gaps, that will stay consistent. Right. So one of the issues often, and not just here, but worldwide, I've actually seen literature about the fact that, sometimes in other places too, not having consistent boundaries in which data is collected actually hampers time series analysis, right? Longitudinal studies. And here in the U.S., again, if you're not a U.S. listener, you're not familiar that boundaries change every 10 years after the census potentially because of the way we divide things up for the census. Those boundaries mean that if you have a certain census block or census block group, it might not actually have the same boundaries consistently. So that makes it tough sometimes to actually get that change analysis going on. So I think this is really interesting. And the webinar is not posted yet. So unless you attended it, I don't think it's available to listen to. But I was actually really interested to see this possibility and to see what they're planning in terms of the types of data that will be released and, potentially a timeline. So not a lot of details on that yet, but something to think about. And again, gridded data, just like any data, you have to think about, the implications of using it, right? Because there are, in fact, some data sets that are important to know that their boundaries created. Like, for example, economic data will vary for counties and things like that, because those are the boundaries in which those activities sometimes take place because of taxes and stuff. But anyway, this is actually really interesting.
Yeah, this is, I think, going to be huge because I don't think enough people, even in this day and age, understand. I'm talking about professional GIS geographers, don't understand the importance and the impacts of the modifiable unit problem. So when we move boundaries every 10 years, this creates a significant analytical issue. And we need to be aware of that and factor that into our analysis. It's just nothing you can't eradicate it completely, but having a common grid lines that do create their own other auxiliary problems and headaches, but doing so makes it analysis a little more consistent and a little easier to do across time. And that's going to be wonderful. I'm kind of curious how far back they'll go. I'm assuming they'll do the 2020 census in this grid pattern, and hopefully they'll do the 2010 and the 2000, but who knows?
Yeah, I think it's going to help with stability, but also efficiency, because, the gaps and overlaps is something that we always deal with, and you're always looking for a way to approach it to minimize that impact when necessary. So this hopefully will address some of those issues when appropriate, the best fit at the time.
Yeah, and they did mention it's going to be in addition to, so not replacing, I believe, during the webinar.
And that's the thing, right, is that the data collection is still happening at the address level. It's still house to house, door to door, if you don't respond digitally to the request at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the cycle. But it's one of those things, we saw the transition for Statsco and Zergo to so soils data in the U.S. to raster, and a lot of that was to support the fuzziness and the edges and things like that of soils. And I'm kind of curious to see the methodology here, because of course, whenever we're talking about a pixel, even if it's a large pixel, it's going to be smaller than, say, a tract or a block, so that, we can go through and potentially pick out an individual. But as long as they do it well, we're still going to be dealing with some of that fuzziness. And that's the nice thing about rasters, is that, yes, we lose the hard boundaries, which themselves bring issues, but it does give us that little bit of chance for fuzziness in the data set as well. So curious to see how that goes.
My only request to anybody from federal agencies is, could you all get the same grid-ish? I mean, I don't mind if there's subdivisions of grid, but as long as they're all the same doggone size grid things, so we can compare things to things, because that's what GIS does. Having one 30 and the other one 40 is annoying.
Yeah.
Well, and let's talk about the fact that, do we really need grids or do we need hexagons? Which one is better? I mean, we're talking about people and places. So is Crystal our basis?
I was sort of thinking hexagons in my head, even though I was reading the word grid.
Yeah.
I'll be straight up. I don't care. Pick one. Just everyone use the same
Yeah.
one. That's all I care.
Yeah, and they will have a challenge, right? Because they do have to maintain that privacy thing, as you just pointed out, right? They cannot release data that potentially could identify individuals. So that'll be a challenge to do gridded stuff and not have it do that.
Well, but that's where you go with the fuzziness. Yeah, you're representing a number across a larger area, even though it's being represented by a cell of whatever shape.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that it's that value in that. But of course, then you have the whole explaining that to non-professionals and people thinking that their data, because their house is the only one in that pixel.
Yeah.
No. It's not that.
Well, that's the thing. What will that be? Yeah. So it's
area.
interesting, right? I think it's cool, but I think there's a lot that they have to do to try to figure out how to make it actually happen. So
we're running out of time because we're already in 2023. And there's only, 2.5 years left before the methodology has to be locked?
Yeah, the gear up, and then then they start engaging it. So
yeah.
That's the thing that people don't understand about census is that okay, we did that, we're good for 10 years. No, you're not. You're good for 10 months, maybe. That's
well, that's just that the enumerators are hard on the ground starting 2 years before. That 2 years before, the people who are planning have been doing this planning since probably before that 2 years. So they've probably been thinking about this for a decade at this point. So we'll see how it goes. A couple of pieces of news that are related to legal aspects, which we talk about occasionally. Apple recently released a report on various data requests, but specifically highlighting Geofence warrants and providing data on the number of requests and how many devices were included in these requests as part of warrants. Is just kind of interesting. So, they give it by large area, basically their sales regions.
Ridiculously large area.
Yeah. And it's just, so it's
Well, what's interesting, they said is, they get these requests and how many they've fulfilled, but really they don't have the data necessary to fulfill these requests. That's, just you're getting that data and they're looking at where people are basically scraping, the open data from and buying, but it's not going to always give you what you think from them.
You also get a little bit of a sense of their sales numbers, because it says number of devices, and it's just the uneven landscape is amazing. I was very surprised at the sheer volume in Europe, Africa, and Middle East and India, how it was relatively small.
Well, it's also possible that they require a more confined area for their warrants for their requests. So that might have something to do with it as well. And we know that Europe has a very confined, they're not going to say, yes, you can ask for data for this county. They're going to be like, no, if you have a warrant, this warrant is going to be very specific. So that's, I think, part of that as well. To go along with that, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has been called out quite a few times, and we've touched on this not just for them, but for other agencies as well, buying commercial data. And of course, once you buy that data, it's really easy to mine that down to individuals once you start combining 2 or 3 different data sets. And so they've been called out by lots of rights groups, but also beginning to be called out by politicians, specific U.S. senators and people in the House. And so they've quote, promised to stop buying smartphone location data. How much that really plays out, we don't know.
What was interesting to me was that part of the discussion was that buying from this commercial data, a lot of what they're getting isn't even going to answer the questions that they have. That, it's open data, so there's a whole lot of it, but it's not necessarily what you need for decision making, which is part of this whole idea of, not just geoethics, but just not understanding what spatial data does, what it's capable of, and what its limitations are.
Well, I'm curious about your use of the term open there. What do you mean by that?
On the open market. So
commercially available, but not
commercially
open data.
available. Yeah.
Not open.
Yeah, not open,
data.
but commercially available just because it's available to buy does not mean that what you're buying meets your needs. It's like getting a surprise, a box with a whole bunch of stuff in it.
And also, it's noteworthy that we're presuming that what they define as private commercial data is the same as what everyone else does. So the federal agencies have a long history of saying, well, we don't really consider this bit to be under that remit. And you go, well, I don't see how, but okay. So in the United States, at least. So that's the tricky bit.
Yeah. I mean, we talked a lot about the whole warrantless use of data through purchasing by various organizations, various entities in the various governments over the last couple of years. And yeah, until the courts or the lawmakers get involved, there's nothing really keeping them from doing it.
Well, I think, didn't they mention that there was actually an attempt to pass something on that didn't make it through Congress in the U.S. last year?
Yeah, it's not terribly surprising.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, until we have a clear definition, though, it's up to their own interpretation. It's a little bit like saying, I'm not going to eat sweets anymore. Well, it's a birthday cake. That would be rude not to. You're going to get a bunch of those. And finally, in the news this week, Unity has announced an entire new pricing scheme for their products. And this is important because an awful lot of what we've been doing, certainly in virtual reality and virtual worlds, but mixing some of the serious games in 3D, uses the Unity engine. And one of the things that happens out of this is that because of the new pricing, it's going to be relatively expensive for, low indie or not the big wigs, basically, to launch new products using the Unity gaming engine. And so this has been, if you use it, you should look in it, figure out the implications. There are still some open stuff for private use or personal use, educational use. It doesn't exactly impact that, but it could potentially massively change your decision-making in your products if you're doing 3D virtual stuff at all in particular.
Well, but I think too, so this weirdly follows on from the discussion we were having in our topic last time, right? Is that there's actually a little bit more to it than that. So I'm not going to go into the whole firestorm in this sector. But to clarify, if you're not familiar, I mean, we've talked about it a lot in the podcast. Unity is their sort of real-time immersive platform for developing not just video games, but film, and animators use it. And they actually won't be subject to this, but also for, as Frank noted, serious games and things. But one of the other issues to point out is that Unity essentially is saying that this runtime will include all games, I believe, and they have tried to walk back a few things, as of January 1st. So for those people who had already developed on the platform, with the subscription models, their payment will now be subject to the fee as well. So there's a lot of question marks about changing terms of service for existing products and things like that. So there's some other things going on. And I would say that if this is something that you're a Unity user, or you're potentially thinking about developing something in 3D, because there are, as we talked about last time, options that you kind of have to decide through, it would be worth it to investigate a little bit of that, because it isn't just the fee itself and how much it will be that has impacted people's thoughts on this and decision-making. It's how the changes came about and what the implications are for if you develop in something and it's out there. And the other thing related to this is a question, I think, more broadly for software, if this were to catch on, is the company has said that they will decide how many installs you have and what you be charged based on their own proprietary counts and model. And that's tough, right? Because then that means if you're budgeting, like Frank mentioned, like a small indie studio or somebody that would be towing the line of this, you don't have any way independently necessarily to track how that's happening. Or what you might be on the hook for. And those are serious concerns. And installs, even for something maybe in the educational realm, I mean, how fast do you get up to that number? Reinstalls or mistakes, or as people have, kind of said, bot attacks, all kinds of things play into it. So it's a little bit more than just the money itself. It's how it will work, and some real question marks on how it's being done.
Yeah, so it's worth noting that the user community, I'm going to generously say, reacted overwhelmingly negative to this particular thing. So I think this is an ongoing story. It's going to be an ongoing story. Unity attempted to say, "Oh, we'll explain some things a little bit more," and everyone decided that, well, not everyone, but the vast majority of people went, "That doesn't explain anything." So I have to expect that this again will be an ongoing thing, that Unity is going to probably have to tweak it over time. So this probably won't be the last word on this.
One of my favorites was don't worry, it's going to be up to Apple, Microsoft, and Sony to pay for this particular situation.
Oh yeah, they were like, huh?
Yeah.
It basically said if you have a subscription pass or whatever, apparently the company is going to have to pay the fee. Like what?
There are a lot of discussions about this with open educational content on Steam. How is this going to impact what's available there?
Absolutely. There's so many
I'm
implications.
Sure Steam's going, what? Along with everyone else.
And that's it for the news.
Well, we're happy to be joined today by Anthony Villanti, Managing Director and Founder of GapMaps. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate the invite.
GapMaps is a known product, a well-established product in various portions of the world, but recently you expanded your reach a little bit into North America. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, correct. We've been around, we were founded in 2013. We've been in the geospatial industry and location intelligence industry for 10 years now. We started in Australia and moved quickly to New Zealand and recognized the opportunity to sort of grow a global platform. And so the next phase of GapMaps has been really starting to work it out, with our closest neighbors, which is Asia, India, and Middle East. One of the biggest things that we found is that data, census data, particularly in those areas, either doesn't exist or it's at a very, very high level. So we spent many years refining, curating, and building data sets for those markets, which has sort of created that journey of being able to understand census data, geography, and information that's available across the world. And we've been able to build out those populations down to a micro level. You can imagine some of the brands that we deal with, which is the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, the Starbucks, the KFCs. These types of brands require data at a very minute level. They're looking at 15,000, 20,000 person catchments. So when you're dealing in some of these markets, which may have census blocks of 100,000, really, really difficult for them to use that data to make decisions. So we've spent a lot of time using satellite imagery and device data from phones to really refine populations and get the accuracy of population census data down to a micro level. So that leads us to then the US market, which now being 10 years old, we see the opportunity to create a global platform. And so to be a truly global business, the US is certainly an important market for us, particularly many of the major brands that we work with, their head offices in the US. And so it just makes sense for us to be established in the US and provide an effective global platform across all markets. It's been a long journey because we've had to rebuild the platform to make it a global product. So effectively, we're one of the only platforms that you can log in through a single login and get access to all countries of the world. So effectively, for strategic planning, we've been able to have that consistent methodology in all markets that we have and granular population data. And so there sort of came the story to sort of enter the US market and then the Canada market.
Now, one of the keys to GapMaps, I think, is the data. You've touched on that a little bit, and you have some great examples of how the data has been implemented in India, especially. You have a lot of great examples there. But can you talk a little bit about some of the process of bringing that data together and kind of give us an overview of what GapMaps Live provides?
As I mentioned, the India data is a great example where the data is quite difficult, very hard to get income and any sort of class information of population, and obviously significant growth opportunity for many Western brands, but understanding the difference between populations that may be located in the slum compared to wealthy located areas. There's been a process for us, and a lot of the first part of that was really getting the population, daytime and nighttime population right. The second part of that is being able to use information on the ground, such as real estate, housing information, to understand affordability, and then being able to migrate using our demographers and our economics team to understand spend And so therefore we're able to bring some of those attributes that we use in our primary markets across into the likes of India and Indonesia. And what that enables us to do is to understand the consuming class, which we call it, and the affordability of that consuming class across that market. And so therefore, whether it's a cup of coffee or a burger or a fitness membership, we're able to define those markets based on the population and consuming class of that market.
And can you take that a little bit into how your customers would then look at that information through GapMaps Live?
Yeah, so GapMaps Live, effectively, they'd be able to overlay their network of store catchments, and whether their store catchments revolve around a population of 20, 30, 50,000 people, they're able to identify micro level where their existing catchments are. And in areas that they may have gaps in the market, let's just say you've got a gap of 100,000, they can accurately be able to identify that there's potential for additional stores in that 100,000 if they work on a 25,000 person catchment area, rather than just putting a pin on the map and saying, yeah, we've filled the gap. So the important part of GapMaps is really having the correct data to make informed decisions, and particularly at that low level. The data we bring into the platform includes competitor data, precinct data, obviously up-to-date demographic data with forecasts, and traffic data. So what GapMaps Live enables them to do is query what they want to achieve from a location point of view. So if their plan is to open up new locations in heavily dense populations, they can set a query through our Gap Finder to identify those types of stores. If their query is to identify types of stores that may be in retail precincts, then they can look at the competitor intensity, the types of brands that are located nearby, and sort of the clustering of brands to be able to identify opportunities. And so that sort of creates that fabric of a starting point. So for many brands, particularly in the US, that have been established for many years, they are probably more restricted in looking at the future plan, because there may not be many gaps left in the market, or they have to be sensitive of the gaps that are in the market to impacting those existing company stores or franchisees. And so we've built an impact tool. So the impact tool enables you to put a pin on the map, and the GapMaps Live platform will work out what the cannibalization will be. So the effects of that decision on the surrounding store networks. And so if there's 3 or so stores nearby, that will identify what that potential cannibalization will be on those stores. And so using the new technologies that we've built, a real estate person could run some scenarios. They may say, okay, the impact's too high in that location, so they may decide to move the location further down the road to minimize that impact. So having the tool built into the platform enables them to make quite quick decisions, whereas back in the past, that would rely on doing face-to-face type research, speaking to customers, and then probably turnaround time of making a decision would be around about 2 weeks. But in the GapMaps Live platform, decision can be made within about 10 minutes.
You've already touched a little bit on some of your customers, but can you give example of how some of your customers have used GapMap Lives in other regions? Yeah,
certainly. Many of the cafe brands will be entering into new markets, and then looking at the capacity of opportunity to enter those markets. It could be Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore. And so what we've done is have a look at the existing intensities of competitor brands and being able to compare how they're currently performing in other markets and build that relationship into the new market. And so what that's enabling them to do is get a really good understanding of what the opportunity looks like based on how they perform in some of the other markets. So they find that enables them to, one, understand what the ongoing opportunity is, but when you start building into consuming class and growth, then you need to look at how the store growth plan is occurring to the growth of the market. And India is a fantastic example of that, because they've got such a a significant growing middle class. And so looking at the rate of growth of store development in those markets for Western brands is going to be significant. So having the right information and data enables brands to be able to make informed decisions in their future plan.
There's a great series from about a decade ago called Fast Food Gone Global that looks at those things. And so it's exciting to see how companies are kind of reflecting between themselves. In the United States, of course, whenever you get one fast food company, like you were saying, the clustering effect that takes place is just amazing sometimes. And of course, in North America, you have so many new brands that are trying to push the existing brands out. And you can easily see how they can take advantage of these type of these resources in terms of the data you've collected, tools that you've been providing, like the Impact tool. Can you talk a little bit about how some of your other tools kind of evolve around this? Because it's not just GapMaps Live that you've been building over the years. You have other tools as well.
Yeah, one of the exciting tools that we've built is called GapMaps Connect. And GapMaps Connect is an app, so it's a handheld device which enables users to be on the field and be able to collect ground level data. So it doesn't matter whether you've got 100 stores or 5,000 locations, and particularly a good, effective tool for the US where not many people understand what's actually at ground level. So what's at the physical location. So asset management, so understanding what types of facilities are at the store. So the toasters, the fridges, the car parks, the seating, the point of sale systems. I mean, they're all different. And some of those stores may be 15, 20 years old. And so they're probably old legacy type, equipment that's in the stores. And so what I've found over the years is many of these brands don't have a complete asset register of their stores. And so what GapMaps Connect does is enables them to have a live feed of information being passed from the store level directly into GapMaps. And it doesn't necessarily need to be GapMaps. It could be their own desktop solution. It may be an Esri product. It may be Salesforce. But that enables through an API that information, photographs, notes, all to be directly fed back into the platform. So we're very excited about this product because I think it just ties in beautifully with the whole story about data and connection of data, and being able to have, with many of these brands understand store performance and underperformance comes down sometimes to the facilities that are located at the store. So I think it is just a lovely tie-in with Connect, with GapMaps Live. But what I am excited is that it doesn't necessarily solely rely on feeding data into the GapMaps platform. So that's it shows that it's expandable and has other greater value.
All of this is kind of sitting around this idea of location intelligence that has been for a long time in the business world. And, it is something that those of us in GIS usually think of, this is just GIS, but it does have a slight twist on these traditional ideas, both in terms of business statistics and spatial analysis. So can you talk a little bit about how location intelligence drives some of this?
There's two parts to it. I guess you've got to feed in your own business data, and we've built that so the information that comes at store level can be fed directly into GapMaps, and then you've got the data that surrounds the demographic attributes and the movement and behaviour of customers that relate to that location. And so we spend a lot of time, particularly with mobile device data, understanding customers' behaviour, how they travel, where they come from, where they go to. Because I guess in many cases, it's not just people coming from home. People move, people shift, people come from all different places. They come from work, they come from shopping, they come from recreation. And so being able to understand the underlying demographics of customer behaviour gives us a real good understanding of performance. And so being able to tie that back into the company data and build that relationship of customer to performance has been a really important part of location intelligence. It's not just a pin on the map, it's understanding behaviour. And I think once we've been able to pull apart that and pull it back together and being able to present back to the clients, an understanding of who their customer is, it's been really important.
So that kind of brings me to a question that I mentioned before we started recording, and that is, so looking at your LinkedIn page, you have a trajectory. So what brought you to found GapMaps and bring together these ideas and put them together in this way?
Really good question, and it goes back 30 years. And I worked with my father 30 years ago, and it was, I guess, working with one of the first mapping platforms that was ever built was a space-time research product, which came to Australia. I sort of fell in love with the ability to be able to understand. I guess I had projects that I was working with my father that were the old manual way, which is, drawing on the wall and identifying populations, putting the pin on the map. And so I guess that next generation of change, I wanted to be able to automate all of that. So that's when I got the idea for being able to automate a lot of the processes within mapping, be it census, be it identifying what's in a catchment, being able to identify pins on a map. But the limitation for doing that for me, particularly as a consultant, was I could only work one-to-one. And so I had all of this information, all of this capability. So it wasn't until the convergence of cloud-based mapping and AWS and all the other technologies that enabled me to be able to bring all of that knowledge and mapping skill into a platform to make it available to everyone. So it wasn't so much me being a one-to-one to a client. I was able to bring all of that data and intel and make that available to clients. And so when things move, demographics change, points on a map change, and demographic shifts, all of that information can be fed within the platform, and which enables the end user to be able to make informed decisions.
And that's one of the things, right, is that it's about having the data through the tools sometimes, but the data to provide decision making. And GapMaps does a really good job of that from the various pieces that you've already got together without having to, you can bring data in, like you said, but there's so much rich data already there that you and your team have put together. It's heartening. It makes me happy to see it. So I don't know how else to say that. Is there anything else that you want to kind of highlight about GapMaps?
Oh, the highlight is that I guess the opportunity really lends itself not only for brands that we work with in Australia and Asia and Middle East, and those brands that want to come into the US and Canada. I think there's such a nice synergy of those brands looking to expand can use our platform to enter the US market and have the confidence that they've got the right tools and the right understanding of making that decision, because it's such an important and expensive decision. But at the same time, you've got the US brands that will see the opportunities of the Asian market and in India and the growth opportunities. And what this enables them to have consistent methodologies flow through from not only the US, but right across to the end user in that market. So I think it's a great time. I think it's a really exciting time because technology has played a very big part of it, and it continues to grow. And they're very excited to see, the opportunities from a global front and being able to learn a lot more in the US and Canada markets and how we can roll that across to some of the other markets that we operate.
Thank you so much for joining us. Is there a good place for people to go to find out more about GapMaps?
It would be at GapMaps.com. You'll be able to get onto our website and find more information. But happy to provide people a demonstration of the platform, and also appreciate your time today, Jesse.
Yes, thank you so much.
On to the events corner, and of course, as we continue on, there's more and more events in person, such as
Geo Week 2024, which is taking place February 11th through the 13th in Denver, Colorado, which is a bold move given the weather in February in Denver.
And in March 2024, the 18th through the 22nd, you can attend the Game Developer Conference, which, as always, is in San Francisco, California.
Of course, if you'd like us to add your event to the podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
You can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com.
I'm Barb at VerySpatial.com.
I'm available at Kinda Spatial, and you can find most of our contact information over at veryspatial.com/contacts.
As always,
We're the folks in VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
shit.